In the long shadows of empire, in an age when red-coated battalions marched in perfect formation across continents, the British Empire saw itself as the unquestioned master of the Western world. Its soldiers, professional, disciplined, hardened by faraway campaigns, believed in the permanence of that world order. And then, across the Atlantic, in a cluster of restless colonies that many in London barely considered consequential, something unexpected happened. A protest, a riot, a rebellion, and at last, a revolution that would test not only an empire's might but the very beliefs of the men who fought for it. To understand the American Revolution from the viewpoint of the British soldier is to step away from patriotic myths, battlefield romanticism, and the familiar drumbeat of independence narratives. Instead, it is to walk in the boots of men who marched through dense American forests, who fought in brutal heat and impossible winters, who wrote home about a land they barely understood and an enemy they were warned to underestimate. Some believed the colonists were misguided brothers. Some considered them traitors. Others saw them as amateurs whose rebellion would end as quickly as it began. But all of them, regardless of rank, would come face to face with one of the most unexpected developments in military history, a citizen uprising that refused to break. This documentary reveals the revolution through British eyes. Not kings, not parliament, but the soldiers who fired the muskets, marched the roads, and endured the chaos of a war no one in London predicted. Their letters, journals, and reports show confusion, frustration, admiration, and sometimes disbelief. They saw a land too vast to control, a people too determined to subdue, and a war that slowly transformed from a policing action into a draining, demoralizing struggle for survival. By the end of it, many British soldiers no longer wondered why the colonists rebelled. They wondered how an empire so powerful failed to understand them. This is their story, the story of the world's greatest army learning the limits of power, the story of a young nation proving its resolve, and the story of a revolution that forced soldiers of an empire to rethink everything they believed about war, loyalty, and the future of the Western world. To understand the earliest phase of the American Revolution through the eyes of British soldiers, we must place ourselves not among the fiery speeches of colonial patriots, but instead among the red-coated regiments stationed across the Atlantic, men who arrived expecting routine service, not the unraveling of an empire. For these soldiers, the beginning of the movement did not appear as a single moment or event. It emerged as a series of small irritations, curious confrontations, and subtle shifts in colonial attitudes, signs that few recognized as the first tremors of an earthquake. When British troops first marched into Boston in the late 1760s, they expected the usual reception, a mix of curiosity, occasional resentment, but overall acceptance of their authority. After all, they were the king's soldiers, representatives of what many considered the world's most powerful and civilized nation. But Boston was unlike any other colonial city they had seen. Instead of respect, they encountered cold stares. Instead of passive civilians, they found citizens whose confidence bordered on defiance. Soldiers later wrote that the people of Boston did not walk as subjects, a subtle observation that hinted at what was to come. Letters from the period show British troops baffled by the colonists' obsession with rights, representation, and liberty, concepts that most average Englishmen hardly discussed in their daily lives. The British Army operated under rigid hierarchy and unquestioned loyalty. Rebellion was not a political option but a crime, an act of madness. So when colonists protested taxes or accused Parliament of tyranny, many redcoats dismissed the gestures as melodramatic or self-serving. To them, the colonists benefited enormously from British protection and trade. What conceivable cause did they have for complaint? This misunderstanding lay at the heart of the coming conflict. British soldiers saw the empire as a stabilizing force. Colonists increasingly saw it as a distant ruler infringing on their autonomy. And as Parliament imposed new laws, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, British soldiers found themselves on the front lines of a political crisis they neither caused nor fully understood. In taverns and marketplaces, soldiers overheard conversations that troubled them. Men spoke openly about resisting British authority, sometimes with a boldness that startled even the veterans among the redcoats. Women, too, played a role, mocking soldiers, refusing to buy imported goods, encouraging boycotts. Children mimicked revolutionary chants in the streets. The resistance was not confined to radicals, it was becoming woven into the daily life of the colonies. The Boston Massacre of 1770 offered British soldiers a harsh awakening. What began as a confrontation, a crowd taunting a lone sentry, ended in gunfire that echoed across the colonies. For the soldiers involved, the incident was terrifying. They later wrote of being surrounded by an increasingly hostile crowd, unsure whether they would be beaten to death before reinforcements arrived. But the colonial press portrayed the event as a calculated slaughter. In letters sent back to England, redcoats expressed shock and anger at how they were depicted, not as disciplined professionals defending themselves, but as murderers sent to oppress innocent citizens. Over the following years, tension simmered. When British officers walked the streets, they sensed something beneath the surface, a kind of charged silence, like air before a storm. The soldiers believed the colonists were being manipulated by a small group of agitators, Adams, Hancock, and their allies, who stirred unrest for political gain. Few British troops recognized that the desire for independence was spreading organically across the population. Then came the Tea Party. Soldiers stationed near Boston Harbor witnessed the strange scene with disbelief, men disguised as Mohawks boarding ships, dumping tea into the water while thousands watched from shore. To the British soldier, such defiance was unimaginable elsewhere in the empire. In Bengal or Jamaica or Ireland, colonial protests might erupt, but to destroy property of the crown in full public view, and face no immediate consequences, was unheard of. When Parliament responded with the coercive acts, tightening control over Massachusetts, British soldiers assumed the show of force would bring the colonists to heel. But it had the opposite effect. For Americans, these acts confirmed their fears. For British soldiers, they unleashed open hostility that could no longer be ignored. By the time General Gage ordered troops to seize colonial weapons in early 1775, many redcoats understood they were marching into dangerous terrain. But even then, they did not anticipate war. They expected a show of force, perhaps a standoff. What they encountered on the morning of April 19 at Lexington was something else entirely. Accounts from British soldiers describe the colonists standing in formation, untrained farmers and townsmen, yet unwavering. When the first shots rang out, confusion reigned. The British troops, though victorious in forcing the colonial militia to retreat, were shaken. They had just shed the blood of men they still hoped to govern. The march to Concord was worse. As redcoats retreated toward Boston, musket fire erupted from behind stone walls, from forest edges, from hilltops. Soldiers said they could see almost no enemy, only smoke, flashes, and the constant whiz of bullets. It was, wrote one private, like being hunted. Another soldier described it as war in shadows, unlike anything the British Army had ever faced. This was the moment many redcoats began to grasp the truth: the colonists were not bluffing. They were willing to shoot, kill, and die for their cause. The British Army, which had expected to intimidate rebellion into submission, now found itself facing a population that viewed resistance not as treason, but as duty. After Lexington and Concord, British officers issued new intelligence reports. Militias across New England were mobilizing, stockpiling weapons, drilling on village greens. Ordinary people, blacksmiths, farmers, merchants, were preparing for a war against the largest military force on earth. For the British soldier, the early movement no longer looked like disorganized protests. It looked like the beginning of something massive, something dangerous, something that could no longer be dismissed. By the summer of 1775, the British soldier understood that this was no longer about taxes or trade disputes. It was a battle for identity, for autonomy, for power, and the colonists were ready to fight it with every resource they had. The movement had begun, and there was no turning back. When the first shots of the revolution echoed across the Massachusetts countryside, British soldiers suddenly found themselves facing not only a rebellious population, but a cast of figures who would soon become legends, names that British troops wrote about with frustration, confusion, respect, and sometimes fear. Yet in these early years, the Redcoats did not see the American movement through the lens of retrospective heroism. To them, these leaders were simply adversaries whose personalities, strategies, and convictions shaped the conflict in ways that few British officers anticipated. Among these figures, none was more central or more misunderstood than George Washington. British soldiers initially viewed Washington with a mix of skepticism and mockery. Many British officers knew of him from the French and Indian War, but to them he had been an ambitious colonial officer with a mixed record, not a military mastermind. Early British correspondents described him as a provincial planter playing at general, overly formal or dramatic in bearing but uneven in command. His army of farmers and volunteers seemed, at first glance, no match for the disciplined ranks of British redcoats. Yet as time passed, British soldiers learned that Washington's true strength lay not in tactical brilliance but in resilience, an ability to endure defeat without breaking, to retreat without collapsing, and to inspire confidence even when his army stood on the brink of ruin. Letter after letter reveals how British troops slowly began to respect him. "The man does not give up," one British captain wrote. "He fights us today and returns tomorrow as though nothing were lost." To professional soldiers accustomed to decisive battles, Washington's flexibility, his refusal to play by traditional European rules, became deeply frustrating. Every time they thought they had cornered him, he slipped away, regrouped, and re-emerged with surprising force. But Washington was not alone in shaping the Revolution's early struggles. Other colonial leaders, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Benjamin Franklin, were equally influential, though in different ways. British soldiers rarely saw these political architects in person, yet their influence could be felt everywhere. Troops in Boston wrote angrily about the Adams faction, claiming they stirred the rabble and inflamed local discontent. They blamed radicals for poisoning the minds of ordinary colonists against the crown. To many British officers, these men were not patriots but opportunists who had manipulated public dissatisfaction for personal gain. Benjamin Franklin, in particular, was a source of both irritation and intrigue. While soldiers seldom encountered him directly, officers understood his diplomatic role. Rumors spread in the ranks about Franklin's activities in London, his meetings with French agents, his international reputation. "The colonies have a cunning fellow in Franklin," one British sergeant wrote, calling him more dangerous to us than 10,000 militia. It was an acknowledgement not of military power, but of the psychological and diplomatic strength the revolutionaries possessed. But while British soldiers watched colonial leaders rally public sentiment, they also had their own leaders, figures who shaped their experience of the war from the opposite side of the battlefield. General Thomas Gage, who ruled Massachusetts in the early years, was respected by many of his troops but criticized for hesitating to take stronger action. After the Battle of Bunker Hill, where British forces won tactically but suffered devastating losses, many redcoats blamed Gage for underestimating American resolve and fortifications. His replacement, General William Howe, was a more complex figure. Howe was a veteran of earlier wars and initially popular among British troops. Many soldiers admired him, calling him steady, dignified, and prudent. But Howe's cautious strategies bewildered the rank and file. He repeatedly defeated Washington in major battles, Long Island, White Plains, Brandywine, yet failed to destroy the Continental Army. Soldiers wondered why, despite superior numbers and training, Howe allowed Washington to escape, regroup, and preserve the Revolution. Some accused Howe of sympathy toward the colonists, others claimed he simply lacked aggression. "If he would just strike the final blow," one private wrote, "this rebellion might be ended before winter." But the blow never came. Other British commanders played their part: Henry Clinton, John Burgoyne, Lord Cornwallis, each of whom had distinct relationships with their troops. Burgoyne, flamboyant and confident, was admired by many soldiers for his theatrical personality and boldness. Yet his defeat at Saratoga became the first strategic disaster that British troops openly acknowledged as a turning point. After the surrender, soldiers wrote home about the shock of seeing an entire British army, over 5,000 strong, lay down arms. "We had thought ourselves invincible against these Americans," one soldier confessed, "but we were wrong." For the common British soldier, however, it wasn't just the leaders who defined the early years, it was the daily grind of hardship, confusion, and the sheer unfamiliarity of America itself. Soldiers used to European battlefields found themselves fighting in dense forests where visibility was limited and ambushes were constant. The weather seemed almost designed to break their morale, blistering summers, freezing winters, sudden storms, and a landscape so vast that marching felt endless. Disease was another constant enemy. Dysentery, smallpox, pneumonia, and camp fever killed more redcoats than musket balls. Soldiers wrote painfully about watching comrades waste away, sometimes buried in shallow graves far from home. The lack of proper medical supplies and the difficulty of transporting the wounded made the early years grueling. Supplies were another struggle. British soldiers expected steady provisions, bread, salted meat, tools, clothing, but in America everything was delayed, spoiled, or intercepted by guerrilla attacks. In many letters, soldiers complained about moldy bread, rotten beef, worn-out shoes, and uniforms that fell apart long before replacements arrived. By contrast, they noticed that colonial fighters seemed able to survive with less, living off the land, receiving support from sympathetic locals, and adapting quickly to hardship. Then there was the issue of loyalty. British soldiers entered towns unsure who was friend or foe. A civilian who offered directions one day might be seen loading a musket the next. Entire communities shifted their allegiance depending on which army was nearby. This bred mistrust, exhaustion, and paranoia. Here, wrote a British corporal, the enemy is everywhere and nowhere. This uncertainty was unlike anything they experienced in structured European warfare. And yet, some redcoats were surprised to find moments of connection with colonial families. Not all Americans were patriots. Some remained loyal to the crown, welcoming British troops into their homes. Others simply wanted peace and survival. British soldiers often noted the hospitality of ordinary Americans who offered food, shelter, or conversation, highlighting that the war was not a simple conflict of two uniformed sides, but a civil struggle intertwined with diplomacy, personal relationships, and divided communities. These early struggles, battles both physical and psychological, shaped the British soldiers' perception of the revolution. What began as a minor insurrection seemed increasingly like a determined national uprising. The key figures of the revolution, Washington, Franklin, the Adamses, were no longer dismissed as rabble-rousers but recognized as leaders of a growing, formidable resistance. For British soldiers, the early years were a harsh education, an immersion into a conflict unlike any they had ever fought. They learned that discipline alone could not win this war, that clear victories could still lead to strategic failures, and that the leaders on both sides would determine the war's course in ways far more complex than simple battlefield maneuvers. By the end of this period, British troops no longer believed they were suppressing a small rebellion. They were fighting a people who believed profoundly in their cause, and that realization changed everything. For the British soldiers serving in the American colonies, the early years of the war felt like a long series of manageable frustrations, annoying setbacks, stubborn rebels, unexpected skirmishes, and occasional defeats that were significant but not catastrophic. The British Army had suffered losses before across the world and recovered from each. Most redcoats believed the rebellion would ultimately collapse under the weight of imperial pressure. They assumed the colonists would eventually grow tired, lose hope, or submit once their towns were occupied and their armies scattered. But in 1777, a moment arrived that changed everything. It was not merely a military event, it was a psychological earthquake that shifted the minds and morale of British soldiers, the surrender at Saratoga. To understand the turning point through British eyes, we must envision what it meant for soldiers who had always viewed their army as the gold standard of global warfare. For decades, Britain's military reputation had been ironclad. They defeated the French in major conflicts, held vast territories overseas, and maintained an aura of near invincibility. When British officers and troops marched into the thick forests of upstate New York under General John Burgoyne, they carried more than muskets, they carried the confidence of an empire. But the march south from Canada toward Albany, designed to split the colonies in half, became a nightmare. Burgoyne's troops found themselves slowed by terrain that seemed determined to resist them. Every tree felled across the road, every bridge destroyed by local militias, every narrow mountain pass turned into a death trap. This was not open-field European warfare, it was a new type of conflict where the land itself became a participant. While Saratoga is remembered as a battle in American history books, for British soldiers it was a slow, suffocating realization that they were being choked by an enemy who knew the terrain, could mobilize local militias quickly, and fought with relentless efficiency. Burgoyne's army was starved, exhausted, and isolated. Supplies dwindled. Horses died. Soldiers weakened. Guerrilla attacks shredded their numbers. British soldiers wrote of sleepless nights, constant muskets cracking from unseen locations, and the unnerving feeling of being watched every moment. Then came the battles of Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights. To the shock of British soldiers, the Americans did not scatter. They stood, fired disciplined volleys, and counterattacked with coordinated aggression. One redcoat wrote, "These rebels are no longer an undisciplined mob. They fight like Europeans, and with a spirit I have never seen." This was perhaps the first time many British soldiers admitted that the Continental Army had transformed from an improvised militia into a formidable military force. When Burgoyne finally surrendered in October 1777, the British soldiers present felt something deeper than defeat. Many described it as disbelief, humiliation, and a sense that the ground had shifted beneath their feet. Over 5,000 British and Hessian troops marched out and laid down their arms, not because they fought poorly, but because they had been outmaneuvered, outnumbered, and overwhelmed in a campaign that should never have been attempted without support. Letters from captured or surviving British soldiers reveal phrases such as "an empire humbled," "a misfortune beyond explanation," and "the day hope dimmed." What made Saratoga so devastating was not the casualty count, it was the symbolic destruction of British invincibility. Soldiers, even those not present at Saratoga, understood that this was more than a lost campaign. It was a global signal, the rebellion could not be crushed easily. And then, as if the surrender were not blow enough, the next shock arrived: France entered the war. This was the moment British soldiers realized the conflict had transformed. No longer were they fighting disorganized colonists with limited resources. They were now facing a rebellion backed by one of the largest and most powerful empires in Europe. France's alliance with the Americans meant naval blockades, additional troops, global battles, and the stretching of British military resources to breaking point. Redcoats stationed in New York and Philadelphia reacted with dread. Soldiers who once walked with confidence now rode home with palpable anxiety. "We are no longer fighting farmers," one British grenadier wrote. "We are fighting France through these Americans." The idea that the war was expanding into a global conflict crushed whatever optimism remained in the ranks. France's involvement also changed colonial morale. British soldiers noted a sudden surge of confidence among Americans, militias grew bolder, supplies flowed more freely, and the Continental Army stood firmer. From the British perspective, the rebellion now seemed endless. One letter from a sergeant described the sentiment perfectly: "We believed this war would end in a season. It will not end in many years." The turning point was not just military, it was emotional. British soldiers began questioning the purpose of the war. Some wondered why they were risking their lives for a strategy that seemed poorly coordinated. Others questioned the decisions made in London, calling them naive or disconnected from reality on the ground. Many redcoats began sympathizing with the colonists' desire for representation, especially those who had spent significant time living in colonial towns. By 1778 and 1779, the shift in morale was unmistakable. Redcoats wrote about commanders who lacked clear direction, supplies that arrived months late, and a sense that they were fighting not a rebellion but an idea, one that refused to die. They noticed how ordinary Americans, not just soldiers, remained committed to resisting British rule. The war was not simply on battlefields, it was in the hearts of the population. Another overlooked element shaped this turning point: British desertions increased. Soldiers disillusioned with leadership, tempted by colonial freedoms or relationships, slipped away. While not enormous in number, the increase symbolized growing cracks within the Army's discipline and faith. Most importantly, after Saratoga and the French alliance, British soldiers no longer believed the war could be won quickly, or perhaps at all. The turning point was not a moment of British weakness alone. It was a moment of American transformation. British soldiers wrote with surprise and, in some cases, admiration about the strategic evolution of their enemy. They saw Washington's resilience, the rise of new American commanders, and the colonists' ability to weather hardship. The British Army still believed in its professionalism and discipline, but no longer believed that these qualities guaranteed victory. By the end of 1778, when redcoats marched into new campaigns in the South and along the coast, they did so with a different mindset. They were still determined soldiers of the British Empire, but something fundamental had changed. They knew now that the war was not simply difficult. It was winnable only at immense cost, and possibly not winnable at all. The revolution, from the British soldiers' perspective, had reached its irreversible turning point. By the late 1770s, the American Revolution had reached its fiercest and most complicated phase, and British soldiers found themselves moving through a storm of shifting strategies, brutal battles, political confusion, and emotional exhaustion. For the redcoats, this was a period defined by contradictions, moments of clear victory overshadowed by growing doubt, tactical brilliance undermined by strategic missteps, and unwavering professionalism tested by a war that refused to behave like the conflicts they had been trained for. After the shock of Saratoga and the entry of France into the war, British leadership shook off its earlier confidence and decided to change direction. Instead of fighting the rebellion through the northern colonies, the British turned their attention to the American South. London believed that the southern colonies, with their strong loyalist populations and economic importance, would be easier to pacify. British soldiers hoped this shift would finally put them back on a path toward victory. Many wrote home describing the southern campaign as a chance for redemption, a chance to regain the momentum lost in the north. At first, their optimism seemed justified. British forces captured Savannah in 1778 and Charleston in 1780, two of the greatest victories for the Crown during the entire war. Charleston's surrender, in particular, overwhelmed American defenses and delivered thousands of Continental soldiers into British custody. Redcoats felt a renewed surge of pride. At last, they believed, the rebellion was beginning to collapse. But the victories disguised a growing danger. In the South, the war mutated into something far more savage than the battles of Lexington, Brandywine, or even Saratoga. British soldiers discovered that the Carolinas and Georgia were not unified loyalist strongholds, they were fractured landscapes where neighbor fought neighbor, militia ambushed militia, and the rules of civilized European warfare crumbled. Redcoats marched through countryside marked by burned homes, murdered families, and militias that disappeared into the forests after unleashing devastating hit-and-run attacks. Instead of fighting a formal army, British troops found themselves confronting a population engaged in guerrilla warfare. For many British soldiers, this was the most psychologically exhausting part of the entire revolution. They had been trained to face opposing lines and disciplined volleys, not invisible enemies who struck from the trees and melted into the swamps. Major battles still took place, Camden, Guilford Courthouse, Kings Mountain, but these were only part of the story. The true struggle in the South came from constant harassment, ambushes, and the inability to distinguish friend from foe. A British soldier could march through a small town and be greeted politely, only to be shot at an hour later by the same residents forming a militia patrol. Many redcoats wrote bitterly about this, calling it a war without fronts or a country in rebellion not only against its king, but against itself. At Camden in 1780, the British won a decisive tactical victory. Redcoats cut through American lines and sent Continental troops fleeing. Soldiers celebrated, believing this would break the rebellious Southern armies once and for all. But the opposite happened. Despite losing battles, American resolve hardened. Leaders like Nathanael Greene reorganized their forces, avoided catastrophic confrontations, and dragged the British deeper into a campaign that drained supplies, manpower, and morale. British soldiers soon found themselves marching hundreds of miles across scorching heat, through disease-ridden swamps, and over terrain that punished every step. Shoes disintegrated. Food spoiled. Horses died. For many redcoats, the greatest enemy during this period was not the Continental Army, it was exhaustion. Compounding these struggles were leadership tensions. Officers disagreed on strategy, communication with London lagged for months, and the overall direction of the war grew increasingly unclear. British soldiers, who relied heavily on discipline and structure, sensed this chaos. Letters from the front describe commanders who contradicted each other, operations launched without proper coordination, and orders that seemed disconnected from the realities on the ground. Meanwhile, American forces, though still undersupplied, became increasingly adaptive. Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, used guerrilla tactics the British could not effectively counter. Daniel Morgan's sharpshooters targeted British officers with uncanny precision. Local militias cut supply lines, captured wagons, and attacked isolated detachments. To the Redcoats, it felt like the Americans were everywhere and nowhere at once. The psychological toll was immense. British soldiers who had once viewed the Americans as inferior now admitted they were matched against an enemy who excelled in a kind of warfare Britain had never mastered. One British officer wrote, "These rebels fight differently than any foe we have known. They refuse to finish the war we try to begin." As the fighting escalated in the south, another major challenge loomed overseas. The French Navy was now active along the American coastline. British soldiers heard rumors of naval defeats, blockades, and the possibility that reinforcements might never arrive. For an army operating thousands of miles from home, cut off from reliable resupply, uncertainty became a constant companion. Redcoats joked grimly that they were fighting with one eye on the Americans and the other on the horizon, unsure whether a French fleet or a continental assault might strike next. Everything began to converge in 1781, when General Cornwallis moved his army into Virginia and eventually fortified the town of Yorktown. To British soldiers, Yorktown initially felt like a secure position. They dug trenches, established defenses, and waited for expected resupply from the Royal Navy. But then came the moment that would define the peak, and the beginning of the end, of the entire war. The French fleet arrived first. British soldiers at Yorktown described the sight as heartbreaking, dozens of French ships blocking the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off escape, reinforcement, or supply. For the first time, Redcoats understood that they were trapped. When Washington's Continental Army and French forces marched toward Yorktown, the sense of impending doom grew stronger. Redcoats held their positions, firing volleys, manning trenches, and maintaining their discipline even as thousands of enemy troops encircled them. The siege was brutal. British soldiers endured constant bombardment, dwindling food, sleepless nights, and the terrifying realization that no relief fleet was coming. They fought with courage, but each day the American and French trenches crept closer. Eventually, Cornwallis requested terms of surrender. To the exhausted British soldiers in Yorktown, the moment felt surreal. They had survived years of marching, fighting, and hardship, only to face the same humiliation suffered at Saratoga. Many wrote that Yorktown felt not like a defeat, but a final confirmation. A confirmation that the British Empire could not break the American resolve. A confirmation that the strategy had been flawed. A confirmation that the war, for all practical purposes, had reached its peak and its tipping point. The challenges had overcome the victories. And the Redcoats knew it. When the guns finally fell silent and the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, the American Revolution entered its final chapter, but for British soldiers, the end of the war was not a clean conclusion. It was a moment filled with shock, introspection, disbelief, and a deep sense of consequence that would ripple across the empire for decades. The men who had marched across continents under the Union flag, fought in thick forests, endured scorching southern heat, survived starvation sieges, and watched comrades fall, now returned to a homeland that struggled to understand how a global superpower had failed to pacify a group of colonies across the Atlantic. For many Redcoats, the aftermath began with the emotional weight of Yorktown's surrender in 1781. Even though isolated fighting continued for months, British soldiers knew the war was effectively finished. When news of the surrender reached London, the reaction in the ranks was sobering. Soldiers wrote that pubs fell silent, church bells rang not in celebration but in mourning, and officers avoided eye contact with their men. The idea that Britain, victorious against France in the 7 Years' War, dominant across the seas, respected throughout Europe, had been defeated by its own colonists was a heavy burden to bear. The returning soldiers encountered a homeland dealing with economic strain, political finger-pointing, and public confusion. Some citizens viewed the soldiers as heroes who had fought bravely in an impossible war. Others, however, blamed them. Some newspapers criticized commanders. Others blamed Parliament. But few understood the reality that British soldiers had lived through. Redcoats who returned home tried to explain the nature of the war, the sprawling geography, the environmental challenges, the American resolve, the arrival of the French, the endless guerrilla attacks, and the sense of fighting an idea rather than an enemy. Yet their explanations often met blank stares. Many soldiers wrote that the British public had believed the war was simply a rebellion of hot-headed farmers, not a revolution that transformed ordinary men into disciplined fighters willing to endure years of hardship. British veterans understood this transformation intimately. They had watched the Continental Army grow from a fragile militia into a coordinated force. They had seen American civilians support the cause with a unity that Britain had underestimated. They had witnessed the sheer will of a society determined to define its own future. This realization brought a mixture of respect and sorrow. Some redcoats admitted admiration for the Americans' relentless spirit. Others felt bitterness toward the colonial populations who had once been part of the same empire. But nearly all British soldiers agreed on one thing: the war had been unwinnable not because of Britain's failures alone, but because the Americans believed in something powerful enough to survive defeats, battles, starvation, and despair. For the British Army itself, the Revolution became a painful but essential teacher. Officers reflected on the failures of rigid European tactics in irregular terrain. They studied the mistakes of overextended supply lines and strategies that relied too heavily on loyalist support. They analyzed how an empire could be outmaneuvered by a force with fewer resources but stronger motivation. These lessons would reshape British military doctrine in future colonial conflicts. Perhaps the most lasting impact, however, came from the emotional imprint the war left on the soldiers themselves. Many veterans found it difficult to forget the faces of American civilians they had interacted with: farmers who offered water to wounded redcoats, families who hid their loyalties, children who watched soldiers march by with fearful eyes. The war had blurred the lines between enemies and former countrymen, creating a complex mixture of frustration, empathy, and regret. Some British soldiers stayed in America after the war. They married colonial women, opened farms, or joined frontier communities. They wrote home describing a sense of freedom and opportunity they had not felt in Britain. Ironically, the very society they once tried to control became the one they chose to join. Others carried the psychological wounds of the war, experiencing nightmares, bitterness, or purposelessness. Letters reveal a haunting theme: a sense that the war had changed the course not only of nations, but of the inner lives of the men who fought it. On the global stage, the revolution's impact was immense. British soldiers watched from afar as Britain re-evaluated its policies, hardened its hold on other colonies, and adapted its military strategies. They also saw the world react with shock as a new nation emerged, the United States. France, Spain, and other powers reconsidered their own empires. Revolutionary ideas began spreading across Europe. Ordinary British veterans realized they had been participants not in a colonial rebellion, but in the birth of an entirely new political age. In the long aftermath, some British veterans expressed pride in having served, even in defeat. They believed they had fought honorably, acted with discipline, and upheld their duty. Others felt anger toward the commanders who miscalculated the war or the politicians who misunderstood it. But across these varied emotions, one unifying truth emerged: the American Revolution was unlike anything the British Army had encountered before. In their memoirs, British soldiers often described the war not as a military failure but as a historical inevitability. They sensed that America had grown too large, too confident, and too ambitious to remain under imperial rule. The soldiers' reflections often framed the revolution as a painful but natural transformation, the separation of a mature colony ready to become a nation. For Britain, the loss forced a reckoning that reshaped foreign policy, colonial management, and military practice. For the soldiers who marched through its battlefields, it left memories of courage, hardship, confusion, and humility. And for the world, the revolution became a symbol, a moment where ordinary citizens challenged one of the most powerful empires on earth and succeeded. British soldiers returned home forever changed, knowing they had witnessed the dawn of a new era. They had fought not only a war on unfamiliar soil, but a war against a world changing faster than anyone had expected. And in the quiet of their later years, they understood something profound. The conflict they once saw as a rebellion became a story of liberty, identity, and transformation that would echo far beyond the battlefields they had trodden. The impact of the American Revolution shaped nations, shifted empires, and lived on in the minds of the redcoats who saw it unfold, a reminder that even the greatest armies cannot conquer the will of a people determined to define their destiny.